Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk. We're not going to have a guest on the show this Friday. It's just going to be my co-host, Chad Oban, and I talking about some things.
We don't have a guest, so you remember to actually introduce me to start out.
That's right. That's right. I'm not distracted by the shiny object of having a newsmaker guest on. It's just me and Chad talking politics, which should be as always a good time. I like talking politics with Chad. A lot going on in the state. We are going to have... well, first of all, let's talk about this redistricting lawsuit. So it was... in fact, the last time you and I were on together, like, it literally broke during the show. Ago. And it was, it was hard to know too much what to say of it. We've had it since the past. And I got a little frustrated. I wrote a column, a little frustrated with, because I'm seeing a lot of people in a lot of activist groups and maybe national commentators or reporters kind of characterizing this as this was North Dakota trying to marginalize Native American voters. And I thought that was very, very unfair. For a number of reasons. In fact, I thought that the press release sent out by the North Dakota Democratic Party, insofar as it said that Republicans didn't listen to Native American leaders, I thought even that was unfair, because some Native American leaders very much supported the map. I mean, Chairman Mark Fox from the 3 affiliated tribes was in favor of it. Ruth Buffalo spoke very much in favor of it on the House floor. She voted for it. Now, Senator Richard Marcellet, that's a little more complicated because he did offer an amendment to try to do what the plaintiffs in that lawsuit, one of which was the Turtle Mountain Tribe, of which he's a member, but ultimately he voted for the map. And the map resulted in the election of 2 Democratic Native American women to the legislature. So the idea that this was an effort to suppress Native Americans, I thought that was so unfair. And it's just, that really bothered me that came out. And I think that's an unfair lens through which to look at this.
Well, I also think it's important that we look at this. I mean, Mark Fox and Ruth Buffalo can like the subdistricts at Fort
Berthold.
At Fort Berthold, 3 affiliated tribes, while at the same time not offering opinions on what happened in Rolette County and Turtle Mountain and Spirit Lake, right? I mean, those 2, you can like what happened over there because the geography is different, the population centers are different. You can like what happened there with subdivisions and not necessarily like what happened with Spirit Lake and Turtle Mountain. Those things aren't like, you can do 2 different things. They're both unique geography, unique people as well, right?
Okay, but
we're not saying all Native Americans have the same opinions and on those kind of things. They're separate nations.
That's true. Although Senator Marcellet did ultimately vote for the map as well. Right. So I had a really hard time when we're making blanket statements like this was done to alienate or marginalize or whatever term you want to use Native Americans. I have a hard time for that when all of the Native Americans who were in the legislature at the time voted for it. And when it resulted in the election, it resulted in exactly what it set out to do, which was the election of more Native American people to the legislature. 2 Native American women were voted in from the subdistricts that were created. So I think it's more nuanced, I think, than it's been presented to the public.
I think that is fair, but to say that Democrats voted for the map, so therefore, it's like any other bill, right? You vote for a big appropriations bill, maybe you like 90 of it, but you don't like this 10% over here. That can happen. The other, you mentioned some of your frustrations. I will tell you one of my frustrations. I'm so sick of the legislators on this and the PERS lawsuit blaming the attorneys who bring forward the lawsuits as the reasons why things are getting thrown out. It doesn't, it's not, Peter Welty is a Trump-appointed federal judge. That's who threw out this map. And so to suggest that somehow it's these liberal out-of-state nonprofit attorneys who are doing this, no.
Yeah, the
judge makes the determination on what's illegal and not illegal, not the people who bring forward the lawsuit. Anybody can bring forward a lawsuit.
Sure. It doesn't mean we have to like the lawsuit. I mean, if we want to look at this philosophically, like, I really struggle with the idea that we don't want to have gerrymandering, right? We don't want to draw legislative lines to produce certain political outcomes, and yet that's exactly what we're trying to do. That's why Turtle Mountain and Spirit Lake wanted us to draw this gigantic legislative district in northeast North Dakota that looks like a dumbbell. I mean, to me, that looks like the very definition of gerrymandering, and I don't know how it's any better if it's in pursuit of an outcome we want. And then the standard we use is like, because the Voting Rights Act it's not just if you draw lines that are racist on their face, but also if you draw the lines in a way that doesn't produce an equitable outcome at the ballot box. So now we're like the judge literally does the map, and it's like, well, Native Americans make up this much of the population, ergo they should hold this many legislative seats. I object to that analysis because it doesn't take into account how many Native Americans are choosing to run for these offices. How many of them are acceptable candidates, not just to white voters, but to other Native American voters? There's so much more nuance there that we're not, that the analysis that is used under the Voting Rights Act doesn't take into account.
Yeah, but I think what you're talking about here is changes to the Voting Rights Act, right? I mean, here's the thing. They had a week-long court hearing on this, where evidence was provided. The Trump-appointed judge determined that this was not a legal map. I will tell you, it's my understanding at the hearing, they looked at that, that the district that folks wanted with Turtle Mountain and Spirit Lake, and they determined that, based on a computer or something, that it is more compact than several other districts in the state that were passed as part of this bill.
Depending on how I don't see another legislative district that is shaped that way.
Well, I mean, you're old enough to remember when they used to put little notches in to make sure that Bill Devlin or other people ended up in there. So I mean, yeah. So I mean, this stuff happens. Well, I think this is complicated. I think this is very, very complicated, and for people just to suggest that for legislators to suggest everything we did was right, or they brought in their maps too late. The Constitution, the law doesn't care about the timing of when the maps are brought in. Either the map is legal or not legal, and that's what the Trump-appointed federal judge determined.
So I think you touched on what I think is about. I don't have a problem with Judge Welty's ruling, insofar that I think it's based on flawed law and flawed jurisprudence around that law. Starting back in, I think Justice Alito, I can't remember if the Voting Rights Act has been through the ringer in the courts, and I think it may be time for Congress we got to start fresh, because I think you look at a lot of the rulings from around the country, a lot of them seem contradictory. I think it's very hard. I mean, sometimes I feel like these laws, the judgments could be decided by a roulette wheel, which is kind of what I wrote in my column. It's hard to look at the law and then look at the map and discern what are we supposed to be doing right. I think the lawmakers in Bismarck, by doing these sub-districts, I think they really were trying. In fact, I think Judge Welty acknowledged that they were making an effort to try to be more inclusive of the Native American communities. His argument was essentially, per the Voting Rights Act, they didn't go far enough. Now again, this map has also been in place for one election cycle. So the idea that it didn't go far enough and produce the right ratios of races in the legislature that I guess the Voting Rights Act or the jurisprudence around it demands, I guess. I don't know how we conclude that after one election cycle.
But I think also, Rob, saying that this is like a roulette wheel when we turn it into the federal courts. There are a lot of things in federal law that are very, very complicated, right? And so, I worry that when we're saying we send stuff to the federal courts as just a roulette wheel to see what comes out the other side, that we're really doing a disservice to sort of the institution of our courts. And we do, basically people lose even more faith in our courts by suggesting it's a roulette wheel. Welty,
it's not that is not when I say the roulette wheel. I'm not saying that that's because Judge Welty doesn't have integrity or anything. I am saying that the law and the jurisprudence that he has been given to build his opinion on is flawed. I think this is a Congress problem, not a Judge Welty or a court's problem, or even a plaintiff's problem. I don't begrudge Turtle Mountain and Spirit Lake from having their day in court. They're allowed to do that. That's not the problem.
Right.
I think the problem is we have very, very poor guidance on how to do this.
And the state is appealing this, right? They're appealing this. They'll have their day in court. They'll probably ask for a stay. My concern is that they'll get a stay that goes too long, and then we'll have another election with potentially a legal map. And now we're halfway through the decade and we're about ready to do this again, right?
Right.
If they don't put this into place. But I couldn't help but read some of the commentary from legislators and think about the PERS lawsuit and seeing Sean Vita standing on the floor saying, the only reason we're here is because attorneys brought this lawsuit forward. Yeah, no, the only reason you're here is because you broke the law.
So, and that,
you didn't follow the law.
That touches on another thing where, and it touches on a couple of recent stories. It's the filmmakers who were in the Memorial Hall outside the governor's office this week, pointing out that, there was a grant process for about $700,000 in film grants that was not very fair and it was not very open. And even though for the bulk of it, a $600,000 grant that was appropriated earlier this year during the regular session, it went through a competitive process where they asked, but that process lasted 6 days. And when that amendment for that $600,000 was put in, it was said in the amendment, although not in the text that made it into the bill, but it said, the legislative intent is that this goes to Canonical Productions. Well, okay, I'm not a lawyer, but I know that our state constitution has a prohibition on gifts given to individuals or companies by the taxpayers. And so I feel like if the legislature makes an appropriation and basically directs it to a single company, I feel like that's a gift. So, that's another one where if somebody wanted to file a suit and drag that before the court, how many pass-through appropriations like that, where it's directed like that, would get struck down? By the way, I feel like this is also relevant because former Senator Ray Holmberg, who is currently facing criminal charges for international travel to allegedly have sex with children,
rape children.
He is that's I understand. I saw the activists who want to characterize that way. The law also says it a different way. Okay. I'm trying to describe the way he's been charged. I am agnostic as to the semantics of it. It's disgusting. I think we can all agree it's disgusting. Yeah. What he's alleged to have done. He's not been convicted. But those trips were paid for by an organization that got the same sort of pass-through directed appropriation or grant or whatever you want to call it. Like, it was routed through DPI, but DPI didn't really have any say over it because the legislature basically said, we want, what's the organization, Global Bridges or whatever, we want them to have the money. And then that money was used to pay for lawmakers to take vacations basically to Europe or other places. And there's a lot of stuff like that where, if you look at the Constitution and then you look at what they're doing, it's like, how is this legal?
So I kudos to the filmmakers for standing up, because when they stood up and I started to think about all the pass-through grants that I'm aware of that go through Commerce, that go through DPI, those are the two that I'm most aware of. And I'm not going to go into specifics because I haven't dug deep into these things, but I came up with dozens of different examples in the last few sessions where the legislature is having conversations about a specific company who does a specific thing and giving them $3 million last session, right? And I don't know what the bid process was after that, but there certainly is legislative intent for these dollars to go to specific people. And, until the filmmakers sort of stood up and said, this is wrong, it hadn't occurred to me how sort of gross it is.
So I don't have, and I think you can get around if you have a competitive process for it, right? Then you're not funding a specific company, you're funding a program. We say we're going to have a grant program, and every year there's going to be $250,000 or something available for filmmakers. These are the criteria, and then it's going to be open. And so every year on June 1st or whatever the date is, filmmakers can begin applying for the grants. It ends on June 30th. The Commerce Department has 2 weeks after that to pick the winners. That to me is legal, and that's kosher, and I would support that. I like the idea of supporting specifically our film industry in the state. But that's a very, very different thing, right? That's a very sort of agnostic, we just want to support this industry, and whoever's participating in this industry is welcome to come and give it a whack to try to get one of these grants. I like that. I think that's fine. I think that is good policy. I think where it gets into a problem is where we say, well, we're going to make a grant available and people could bid for it, but I mean, if you're one of the, because by the way, they had this 6 business day, I think it was 10 calendar days, 6 business day, and by the way, they announced the grant at 4:00 p.m. on a Friday, which was just, I mean,
news dump.
Friday news dump. So they do that, and it's like 3 other companies besides Canticle Productions, which got the grant, 3 others applied. How do you feel if you put the time and effort, however many hours it took to put together a proposal, knowing that the money was sort of earmarked by the legislature to go to Canticle from the start? Like, thank you for wasting my frickin' time.
Yeah. And then this led to you writing a column about Doug Burgum should come home and do his job, which I thought was very interesting. And it appears like the governor's office didn't like that column very much based on the next day's column.
They did not. No, they pushed back, and they pushed back. They made the point, not unfairly. Mike Nowatzki, Governor Burgum's spokesman, made the point to me. Governor Burgum, by the way, campaigning in New Hampshire while all this is going on. Mike Nowatzki, made the point to me that, and the point they were making was not unfair. He's like, Commerce Department's getting the snot knocked out of them for this. But hey, by the way, the legislature directed this. We were following. Now, I don't think that's a complete exoneration. The Governor Burgum has a veto pen. They're not obliged to go along, and they're certainly, if they feel like something's unconstitutional or not right, they're not obliged to do that. This is just another perfect example of this is the way we've always done things, and nobody's ever had a problem before, so therefore it's legal. Just like the multi-issue bill, right? I mean, we talked about that when the court struck that down, and we were all like, we all knew it was happening, and we all just kind of became inured to it until they got called on the carpet. And you know what? The courts were right. And it wasn't, although, I mean, my feelings about the PERS board and their motivations for filing that lawsuit aside, their argument about the multi-issue bill was the correct one. And the court made the correct ruling, and the fault for that lays with the legislature. And for the legislature to stand up and say it's some Florida attorney who came up here and did this, again, it's like a kid who keeps doing things that are wrong, but always has an excuse for how it's somebody else's fault. If I just wouldn't have gotten caught, then we wouldn't have been, we wouldn't have this problem right now. It feels like a Scooby-Doo villain that got the mask off and is like, I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for these kids. If it wasn't for these out-of-state do-gooder attorneys. Now, I mean, that being said, like the multi-issue bill thing, I mean, it was a bad blunder. I don't necessarily think that everything is nefarious here. Canticle Productions does good work. I mean, it's not, I mean, their End of the Rope film, I don't know if you saw that. It was a good film. I do want to support artwork like that, art and industry like that in our state. I mean, it's not like they took the money and they didn't produce something. But it does give the perception of sort of a good old boys finger on the scale. Connections get the state dollars, and I don't know if these guys what their connections are to legislators, but I look at some of the appropriations for different nonprofits around the state and who have connections to specific legislators. I don't think there's anything bad that's happening, but it does sort of give that perception that you have to be connected, you have to be part of a certain group in order to get these appropriations, and that's what people lose. That's why people lose trust in the system. Well, so yeah, I was just going to make that point at a time right now where it's like we have so much anger out there, and everybody wants to tear down these institutions because everybody's corrupt and everything's doing a terrible thing. It doesn't matter. Like, the process matters. Like, even if the process leads to outcomes that are not that objectionable, we still need to be able to look at the process and say, this process had integrity. This process was fair. And I don't know that we can always do that with some of these grants, the way we're doing things. Again, I don't want to impute that it was like evil or that I don't want to go that far, but the legislature, the state's got to clean up its act a little bit. They can do better at this. They can do better. And again, when people are always looking for something to be angry about, and I will be honest, when the Wayne Stenjum emails got deleted originally after he passed away, my first thought was, come on, there's nothing there. And then all of a sudden there's all this other stuff that sort of, smoke around it. And again, we don't know what's in those emails or not in those emails.
We don't know what was taken out of his office. I mean, when it
gives the perception that there's something going on there. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I generally have trust in our government and the people running our state. But it makes you think, man.
I have a really hard time. Somebody who knew Wayne Stenjum and worked with him fairly extensively over the years. Obviously in a reporter and he's somebody I was covering capacity, I had a lot of respect for him. And it's very, very hard for me to believe that there was anything that he was covering up, like serious criminal wrongdoing. The problem is I will never know. Not really. Right. I mean, and we've talked about that so much. Speaking about people getting mad and upset, I mean, that's kind of the property tax issue, right? We want to pivot to that, where, I think we've talked a little bit where it does seem like they're not exactly going gangbusters getting signatures. Now, that being said, I think it's still a very, very good chance it's going to get on the ballot. Yeah. It's just maybe there's not the groundswell there that I thought. But I will tell you, before we started recording this podcast, I was talking with somebody who had who told me, and this is a very level-headed person, not really a political person, doesn't hold elected office or anything, just a citizen, acquaintance of mine, who's got some property. And he's like, I was against that measure. He goes, but I'm for it now. I got some property. He's got it's not residential property. He does like some commercial stuff. I don't want to give too many details because, but I mean, basically it's kind of and it's a 270% property tax increase. And he's just livid about it. It's like, I got to go out and get a loan now to pay my property tax on this. Right. Because they came out and they assessed it higher, and then every taxing entity, increased their mills where I'm at. And now I've got to pay it's a combined $16,000 in additional property taxes on these two pieces of property. And the increase, a $16,000 increase, it's $8,000 a piece, basically. He's mad and he's going to vote for it now. And so when I hear stories like that, that's what makes me very, very afraid that this measure is going to pass, despite I know the public polling has not looked favorable for it, but that can change once the debate starts in earnest. And I'm afraid that people are going to be angry enough to pass it.
Yeah, I think that the more people learn about the ramifications of this, the more they will be opposed to it, frankly, right? I mean, just on the face value, nobody likes paying property taxes, right? I mean, and this isn't a vote about if you like property taxes or if you're not, you don't like property taxes. If that was the vote, it would be overwhelmingly people don't.
This is a vote is, do you support this specific change to property tax law?
And so those of us who are opposed to it are really going to have a real conversation with the voters of North Dakota about why this is the wrong approach. But I don't think it's going to be a campaign where the opponents of this are saying everything is fine with property taxes, because I don't know that everything is fine with property taxes. But I think that the proponents of this, in your column earlier this week about sort of the folks who are gathering signatures and sort of the combining of a series of different sort of
grievances,
things, I think is really going to hurt the signature gathering process, because that guy that you talked to earlier today, does he want to be associated with the people who, think every election has been stolen and that Doug Burgum is on the take and all those other things?
Well, so to set this up, there's some pictures of a setup, and I think it was the organization Sons of Liberty, which is kind of an out there organization. Their founder was during the Fufang debate up in Grand Forks, threatened the Grand Forks City Council. They had a booth set up at Gateway Mall in Bismarck, and it was two booths for two different measures. One was for the property tax measure, and then they had another booth for, they call it the Election Integrity Act. It's that one that makes all sorts of changes. It's basically motivated by the Trump 2020 election conspiracy stuff. And they want to have, it's crazy. We've talked about that before.
No voting machines, hand counting everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many changes. I mean, they would get rid of like absentee ballots. You wouldn't be able to do anymore. A lot of that kind of stuff. Or no early voting. Although can you still vote? Now I need to go back and look at it. They make a lot of wacky changes to the law. We'll put it that way. But the thing is like around it, they had like signage about stuff that really didn't have anything to do with either measure. Like they had like anti-vaccine messaging there, anti-masking, messaging there. They had like this weird cartoon that showed Bill Gates as like a puppet master, working Doug Burgum like a marionette. So if those are representative of, and then you have Rick Becker, who's the chair and I would spokesman, for the property tax ballot measure campaign. And he's a very polarizing figure, prone to, making a lot of wacky statements. And I think the problem they're going to have is if they're yoking we'll just focus specifically on the property tax measure. If they're yoking that to a lot of the other stuff where it's like, I have to be anti-vax to sign this measure. Yeah, they are going to struggle to get signatures because. Well,
and it is the Charles Tuttles. I heard a story yesterday about signature gatherers up at the state capitol who were very aggressively approaching people. Your column pointed out the fact the way you win campaigns is by bringing people in, not pushing people away. If I'm going into the DMV, Rob, I'm not in a good headspace to start out with. Yeah. I don't need somebody yelling at me about how my property taxes are too high and there's only one solution to it. And just knowing and seeing like the Charles Tuttle, I mean, he was up at the Capitol a couple of weeks ago with a video camera and everybody in the Secretary of State's office making wild accusations. Those aren't the kind of people that run-of-the-mill North Dakotans are going to want to be associated with, or even that the pictures from the Gateway Mall. I mean, I go up there to have lunch at Rockin' 50s. Is that really like I wouldn't want to walk through that gauntlet? Also,
I mean, because there's always that caveat, right? That you and I are weirdos in terms of the political. Most people don't follow this stuff like you and I do.
That's true.
Most people, I would argue, probably don't follow politics the way most of the people in the audience for this podcast do, right? Yeah. We're the minority. And so I look at it for the perspective, like if I'm just Joe Blow public and I'm just a normal citizen who follows politics in the normal ways, and I've heard something about this property tax measure, then I go in there and there's a sign, it's like, vaccines are terrible and don't wear a mask. I mean, and that stuff's like so pandemic. Like we're so far past the mask debate. Why are you still litigating this? But it's like they have all this stuff around that's going to give me a perception of the property tax measure that really, I mean, I will even argue with somebody who opposes the measure that that's not fair. The measure's not about vaccines and it's not about masks and it's not about how you might feel about Bill Gates. It's about property taxes, but they're injecting all these other messages around it, and it's a distraction. Like it's going to hurt them.
Right. And it's a symptom of not getting the signatures at a pace that Becker and the others had hoped for, that you're having to do that. I mean, and not to mention, I don't know how familiar people are with the Gateway Mall in Bismarck. I mean, this isn't the primary mall, right? I mean, it's not like there's a huge amount of foot traffic, and these folks have that thing set up every single day. Up there, should probably not give them too much publicity for where people can find them, but it's in a weird spot as well if you're trying to get foot traffic. So I don't know.
Yeah. By the way, I don't mind giving them publicity. I mean, if you're considering this, go listen to their argument. Go read the measure. I mean, I don't begrudge you if you read it and you decide it's a good idea and you want to sign with it. I disagree with you, but I'm not going to go learn about it. Don't take our word for it.
No, take my word for it.
Don't take Chad's word for it either. Go learn for yourself, but that seems like a very odd decision. And again, yeah, you win. I mean, you've ran campaigns. I've covered them. Successful campaigns build a coalition, often among people who don't agree 100% on everything. Very, very, if ever, very rarely do you see a candidate campaign or an issue campaign win just by the support of one particular faction of voter. Like that almost never happens.
Well, and I think, you talk about Becker being a polarizing figure. I think we both remember when he first got elected to the legislature, I was sort of intrigued by Rick Becker because he was so, he believed what he believed and he didn't care what others thought. He was
thoughtful. He was thoughtful. He was eloquent. Yeah.
Yeah. And worked with people like Josh Boucher on issues related to LGBTQ.
And criminal, he pushed some good criminal justice type stuff.
Right.
That I liked about civil asset forfeiture and whatnot that I thought was good. The problem is like a lot of people, coming into the Trump era and then coming in, through the pandemic has made a lot of people weird. And it's sort of skewed their priorities where now it's just, I think for a lot of people, a lot of people on the right, that's who we talk about a lot, and I think that's a product of the fact that Republicans are dominant in North Dakota. But there's plenty of people on the left too that just see their job as just opposing whatever the other side's for. And Rick Becker, I think, has become that, where he didn't used to be, but I think he's become that.
Well, and we talk about, in order to win a campaign, you need to bring people in. I meant to, but I failed to look at the percentage of vote Becker got and add it to what Charles Tuttle got when he ran for DPI. That's not getting you to 50%, right? Even in the best case scenario. So who are these folks? And part of it isn't necessarily the message, it's the messenger. So you have Charles Tuttle out there talking or Rick Becker out there talking compared to a firefighter or a police officer saying, hey, losing property taxes, this is what it's going to mean for your public safety and those kind of things. I just, to start in the hole that they're already in based on the polling that we saw a few weeks ago, I think this is going to be a very, very competitive race. But I think there are some advantages on the no side from both a policy and political perspective.
Yeah, I think the big advantage is there's not really... I think the disadvantage the no side has is we've been through this before, fixes were promised. Clearly, what was done has not satisfied anybody. So I think there's going to be a resistance to believe if anybody's like, don't vote for this, we can fix this. We've given people a lot of reasons not to believe that. Or I say we, the people in charge, whether it's the legislature, whether it's local governments, they have done a lot of things that, I think have not been helpful and have made people believe that they're not going to. I think on the other side, the problem that they're going to have is, okay, we got rid of property taxes. Now what?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's interesting is, people were super mad this fall when they got their statements. Next year, when they get their fall, the legislatures put a $500 credit on there. So I think a lot of people will actually see their property taxes go down next fall because of that $500 that they're getting, that the state is buying down. But I think if the election would have been held in September of this year, when people were getting their statements, it might have passed.
Yeah.
Very well, likely to pass.
There's a lot of people who are upset. And that's what I keep calling, because I keep getting calls from local officials. And the conversation with local officials I always get called is, well, Rob, you don't understand. We have to do all this stuff. We have to, it's not our fault. Valuations keep going up. And I'm like, from the perspective of the taxpayer, my house becoming more valuable does not help me pay my property tax bill. And also, by the way, sometimes we play games with valuations where maybe a jurisdiction, maybe a county they don't go out and do assessments for a long time, and then they do them and everybody gets kind of sticker shock, because it goes up. They're able to manipulate the value of the thing being taxed, and then they control the rate at which it's being taxed. And it's just, I think we need to caution, I think, local governments. If you keep trying to just talk down to voters, and I say this too, like a lot of local officials, like they call me and I look at their jurisdiction and they're doing great. But they also got to remember there's all sorts of, it's not just counties, it's also park boards, it's also cities, it's also schools, and it's all over the state. Like, so there's hundreds
Well, and
of property
we had that
tax
conversation with
jurisdictions.
Brandon Bachensky, right? I mean, Brandon basically said the city's keeping it low, but this other jurisdiction is going up. So we're still getting hammered for raising property taxes.
Who was he throwing under the bus? I'm trying to remember. I think, was it the county? I don't remember now.
So I think it was the county, but I wasn't sure, so I didn't want to go down.
Well, okay, don't take our word for it. Go, if you live in Grand Forks County, go look at your property tax bill and you figure it out.
So Rob, with all that being said, I do a big enhancement to my house, which I did. I'm waiting for my property taxes next year. I'm going to have to pay more in property taxes, right?
And that's not wrong. I mean, that's
Right.
the way the property tax, you've added value to your home, your tax should go up. That is what it is.
Yeah. And so I agree with the sticker shock, like, hey, I don't reevaluate your property for 10 years and then it shoots way up.
And I haven't done anything meaningful to my home, and it's like.
But it also is that one of those things where, man, I love when my property value goes up and I'm going to sell my house, right? I mean, I love when the valuation.
I mean, that's nice, except you don't realize that until you sell your house. Like a lot of, I mean, like I live at, I mean, if you're on a fixed income and you're living in your last home, right? Like this is my forever home. I'm not going to sell it. Therefore, increases in my valuations don't help me with this, $1,500 or $600, whatever it is, increase in my property tax. It doesn't help me.
Right. You bring up fixed incomes, and one of the things we often hear about is, the little old lady who's getting taxed out of her house. And what we don't talk about enough is, and I don't think enough people take advantage of the tax credits, homestead tax credits that senior citizens can apply for. And so I think more people should look into those programs. I think the state should talk more about those programs and make sure people are fully taking advantage of that if they're in a position where they are getting it's not, from my opinion, it's not happening where people are getting taxed out of their house if people are taking advantage of these programs that are available.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Although situations tend to be complicated for person to person. And also, like, the thing, true. It's always hard to measure this too, because you don't know how, most people aren't going to allow themselves to get to a point where their house gets seized by the government. They're going to make financial, they're not going to just sit there and be acted upon. They're going to make financial. And so how many people are forced out of their family home because they had to make financial decisions because the property taxes or they got hit with a special or something like that. Right. Specials, by the way, specials are another thing, like a whole different ball of wax.
But that's a whole nother thing that people aren't talking about, this property tax measure. Specials don't go away.
Right.
So often when people are mad about their property taxes, they're mad about specials
because they're putting new lights in the neighborhood or something, right?
Right.
And so
those are big numbers.
Those are big numbers. Well, yes. I mean, how would you like it if you're not paying any property tax at all, and then all of a sudden the city comes along and says we got to upgrade the street lights, or we got to upgrade the storm sewers or something, and oh, by the way, here's a special. So now it goes from 0 to whatever, $800.
When you're a local government, you can no longer assess property taxes, but you do have access to specials.
Right.
I think you can count on your specials getting a lot higher moving forward if this measure passes.
Yeah. So I mean, this has always been the struggle. I don't like the property tax. I really don't. I wish there was a better way. I don't know what that way is.
So, and that's just it. I mean, I've talked to people who, like the acquaintance you mentioned earlier, who said, I didn't vote for it last time, but I'm going to vote for it this time because I'd rather it be on my income than on property taxes. Well, that's not the measure we're talking about here, right? I think we could have a whole different conversation if we're talking about how are we going to replace this revenue. But I mean, essentially what we're hearing from the proponents of this is trust us. There's plenty of pork to cut. The legacy fund will last forever. It will not. It'll cover this for about 6 to 8 years.
And by the way, I mean that includes spending the principal of the legacy fund. Like after 6 to 8 years, the legacy fund's gone.
Gone.
Like when you hear us talk about doing things with the legacy fund, we're usually talking about doing things with the earnings from the legacy fund, not touching the principal.
Yeah. So I think that if you're going to get rid of property taxes, like you said, you vote for. And then it's like the dog catching the wheel on the car. Now what? Because it might be okay for a couple years.
But even then, like I don't know. Okay, so it doesn't implement any new local revenue. So that means the state's going to have to do it. Now you're making decisions in Bismarck. Our part-time, term-limited legislature that meets once every 2 years. is now going to be tasked with everything from, does this school need a new building in Culm, North Dakota? Does Crosby need new storm sewers? I mean, all of those decisions are going to have to be made to some degree at the state level, because that's where all the money is going to have to come from.
And if you're living in rural North Dakota, Rob, you've got 12 legislators, I think, in Minot. I've got like 18 in Bismarck.
Right.
Culm has 3.
Right.
You also represent 8 other communities.
Fargo has 102. I don't know if that's right.
So start thinking about, if you're in a rural community and you're in line waiting for money, you're not going to have the juice to get what you commit. And again, if a community wants to raise revenue to do something in their community, it shouldn't be legislators' decision to do that.
I am tired of the debate to end property taxes. What would be a lot more interesting to me is bring me ideas for how to replace property taxes.
Sure.
Right. I would be interested in those ideas. Like, show me how to do it better, because I don't like the property tax either. But if your proposal is we're just going to gut the property tax and then put it on the legislature to figure it out, that doesn't do it for me.
Well, and especially when you have a legislature who wants to get rid of the income tax as well. Right. Like, at some point.
Well, and they're getting rid of the income tax in the context of we're not abolishing the property tax.
Exactly right. So, I mean, I think that the Craig Headlands, the Doug Burgums of the world who want to abolish income taxes,
right,
that's gone.
Right.
That's gone.
And by the way, those people you mentioned also opposing, for the most part, the property tax buy downs. I mean, they don't like that approach. And I think they're correct. I think if the state's going to do tax relief, it should be for a tax the state levies.
But how do you, I mean, I think the horse has left the barn on that one. I think it was the mid 2000s when the state started getting involved in this stuff. So people are now blaming the state. And I could make the case that if we're doing a better job of funding education or infrastructure or whatever, in an ideal world, then our local political subs would lower that property tax. Again, we're not in that ideal world.
No, we're not. We have to live in the world we live in. Although paying for school lunches, by the way, would have helped. I mean, you want to give some direct relief to families. Yep. I'm already over $1,000 for what I've paid for school lunches this year. So,
and Rob, we can do it. My son goes to a Title I school that qualifies where everybody I have not paid for one meal during Evan's 2 years in public schools, because he's at a school where everybody gets it free because 60% or whatever meet the free lunch threshold.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
No.
Aaron and I can afford it.
Yeah.
Right? But just because of he goes to a school with other kids.
I think you just treat it. I mean, I'm tired of like this means testing thing. I'm required to send my kid to school. Right. And the school and the state, as they should, provides public schools that I can send him to. And if I want to opt out and go to a private school, that's whatever. My kids go to public school. It's a service, right? I mean, it's like, well, I don't have to buy the fuel for the snowplow that plows my street.
Or the books. Are we means testing what parents and who has to pay for books and who doesn't have to pay for books at their school? Eating food during the day is part of their experience.
It's not optional. Like sending my kid to school is not optional. Them eating is not optional. I mean, I hope it's not optional. so it's, it's just, anyway, we're getting off on a tangent. Lawmaker emails. I mean, we touched this a little bit with the Stenjum emails thing. I mean, that's obviously the genesis for a lot of this, and what sparked, my colleague April Baumgarten had a story about, because she tried to get the emails between former Senator Holmberg and former Attorney General Wayne Stenjum, because that's, unfortunately, there were questions there to ask. They were very close friends. They were very close political allies. We have heard from the current Attorney General that the former Attorney General didn't recuse himself. Is there more there to reveal? Well, again, it's one of those things. We don't know what's under the rock until we look under the rock. April made a request for those emails. I'm assuming those still exist. Ray's emails at least still exist. But she wasn't allowed to get them because there's a 2019 law that says that emails between lawmakers and state officials are exempt.
Yes. And I think your column points out that I think there was a good intention behind that law. I assume by everybody who voted for it. Again, we don't know what people's intentions are.
I think you can. I don't want to go through and try to dissect everybody's intentions.
Yeah.
I can look at it and I can understand the argument that they made in favor of it. Like I think that's a reasonable argument for doing that.
And I remember the conversation. My wife Erin was in the Senate at the time, and she actually carried the bill on the floor in the Senate because I think Baumgartner's story pointed out the Newspapers Association wanted some amendments. Those amendments got on in the Senate side that made it a little more transparent. Erin was the one that carried the bill on the floor. Then it went to the House and they stripped out those amendments. And then it went back to the Senate. I think there was like 10 people who voted against it ultimately. Not to make this partisan, but primarily Democrats who voted against this, and then a handful of Republicans as well. But I remember having quite a journey of people trying to balance out those sort of transparency, newspaper associations concerns, but also the idea that elected officials are going to have conversations about things, or with state employees. I mean, Judy Lee talked about people in the Human Services Department. They are talking about some pretty sensitive stuff. That there is a need to have some of that not be in the public sphere.
One thing that I think is really interesting, and I don't know how we test this, and maybe this is part of the compromise if we codify this, but as I look at the law, what they have done is they have exempted those emails from open records requests, which means if I file a request, they are not required by the law to comply. They still have the discretion to release emails like that. And it's not illegal for lawmakers to share their emails. Hell, they leak them to me all the time. That's not illegal. There's nothing illegal about that. We're not breaking any law, even though it's a leak and I couldn't request those as an open records. They're free to share them with me.
Yeah, it's their emails.
So why is legislative management or the leadership, or I don't know who would make the decision, why can't they direct legislative counsel to say, listen, this is an extraordinary situation with Senator Holmberg. Why can't they direct legislative counsel to say release the emails?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because they're not really raised emails anymore.
And they would still need to be subject to redactions if there's somebody's private info, and I'm fine with that. I mean, there's legal criteria for that they have to cite to do those redactions and everything. But the whole idea that they're all exempt, they are. I mean, that's the law. But I think on the other hand, they have the discretion to release them.
But I think the question is, who gets to make that determination? Is it an individual lawmaker? Is it the majority leaders? Is it leg council?
Is it legislative management, or does the full legislature have to vote on it? I mean, I understand. I'm posing I'm coming at it a very weird way. But I mean, somebody obviously has the authority to say that it could be released, and maybe that's what we need to codify, is to say there are criteria. Like, they're not open to any member of the public, but if certain criteria are met, then they can be accessed, or then they can be turned over.
How do you create that criteria when you never? Would you have ever guessed this Wayne Stenjum, Ray Holmberg stuff?
No, but we have it now, and we've requested the emails now.
Yeah,
and I feel like there should be some sort of a mechanism whereby, or even just leave it up to the discretion, where we say, like, explicitly, like, legislative management is allowed to authorize the release of emails in response to a public request if they feel it's appropriate. And then at the very least, you could bring political pressure on them and say, why not release these? It's at least better than now, where it's just...
Yeah, but I could see a scenario where you've got a majority party who's in charge of ledge management, who's choosing to release emails that potentially would be embarrassing for somebody on the other side. Fair. I mean,
that's fair.
I think it's hard.
I don't know what the right balance is, but I know, it's not helping anybody. I mean, again, talking about trust in government, we're in a burn it all down era of American politics, and I don't think it's helping. I mean, all these things keep adding up, whether we're, the grants that we've been talking about, the email situation, what's emerged about Ray Holmberg, what's emerged, how he paid for his travel to commit his alleged crimes. All of these things that are coming out. I mean, every one is a new thing where the public's like, what? Why can't we trust? And to me, it's not even a partisan thing. It's it's just people should be able to trust their government no matter who's in charge.
Well, I had this same sort of conversation about public schools this week when the information came out about that superintendent in Mid-Dakota. And it's like with him having child porn, and then there's issues with the West Fargo principal that had child porn and whatever. When there are these unprecedented attacks on public education, when these things happen, it just gives fodder to the people that say that public schools are indoctrinating or grooming children, all that other stuff. And it's just like the legislature needs to stop screwing up. People that work for public schools, again, both places, a vast majority are really, really good. But in this environment, man, it, like when I see those headlines, it's like, here we go again.
Well, because the thing is those headlines are legitimate. And they tell story. I mean, obviously the people who are accused in those cases are innocent until proven guilty, all those things. But I mean, to the extent, I mean, there are certainly, I mean, we know, I mean, there's a situation where educators acted appropriately with children or misbehave in other ways. Those things are real, and you can't just dismiss them and say that they don't matter because, you know, or we don't want to talk about them because it'll give fodder to the people who show up and shout at their school boards for motivated by things that I think you and I would say are not necessarily legitimate. But you can't ignore the fact that there are problems that come up, you know, and it's a far leap to say that it's systemic or anything like that, but it happens pretty consistently.
Yeah. And when those things happen, it's, you know, some people jump to the conclusion that everybody's doing it. Well, 99.9% of people.
It's always hard because it does create a false impression because you see, it's like every couple of weeks I see a news story about somewhere in the country. Well, think of how many teachers there are in the country.
Yeah, right? And you're never seeing stories about Miss Anderson who goes to the school every day and, you know, changes the lives of children, right? That's, you know, and so it's
you hear
hard,
about Miss Anderson who had sex with her middle school student. Like that's, you know, again, can't ignore it, but it does sometimes create, I mean, that's where you need to get into like statistical analysis and say, you know, RT, and actually there has been statistical analysis. Teachers are less likely to abuse children than the general public. So, that was one I've seen was several years ago, but I mean, that's the sort of analysis you have to do to say, is there a problem that is particular to the education industry or the schools that is distinct from just the problems we have in the overall population?
That headline of statistical analysis shows teachers isn't nearly as exciting as superintendent from Mid-Dakota's charge. You know, it's like trying to get the public to pay attention to, but we're getting sort of off subject here. But my overall thing is people are looking for reasons to not trust institutions. And when these things happen, you know, a lot of the legislative stuff, it gives people, and even like with the legislative stuff, it just seems like there's so many things right now. Rob, you and I should not have anything to talk about. You know, think about the timing of the year right now. You and I should not have that much stuff to talk about. And before the show, we had to narrow down the list of the things we wanted to chat about today. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It's good for your business.
I mean, I work in a recession-proof industry, sir. There is never a shortage of things for me to write and talk about. I will say, if I could do a little digression, I do think that's one of the problems with the talk radio medium. Is as a writer, I don't have to write. Like, I mean, I have certain deadlines during the week, but I don't have to write every day. I don't have to write at a set time. If you're a talk radio host, you have to go on at a set time every day. And you have to talk about things, whether there's things really to talk about or not. Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of talk radio hosts talk about a lot of BS.
Well, cable news is the same thing.
Cable news is the same way. They got airtime. They got airtime to fill.
Yeah. Hey, CNN, not everything is breaking news.
Right.
Not everything.
Is the breaking news ever? I don't watch it. Is it ever not on the screen?
There's
breaking news. Something's breaking. Like, can it just be a normal day?
3 days ago.
Yeah. There's not much going on here. Here's some pictures of puppies. Like, wouldn't that be a nice thing to tune into one day? All right. Last thing. Interesting thing. State Representative Brandon Pritchard. And, you know, I reported about this. There was kind of like seeing a lot of like federal committees popping up among the sort of, I know, the Bastiat right, the Trumpy right, the populist right in North Dakota. And the question was, what are they doing with them? Pritchard has two. He has the Young Republicans Victory Fund, I think it's called. And then he's got another one called the Citizens Alliance of North Dakota. And he sent out a press release about it recently. And from the press release, it seems like what it's going to be is they're going to have a pledge. And they're going to be expecting people to sign the pledge, lawmakers, elected officials to sign the pledge. The pledge is to support a lot of very, I want to say not unimportant ideas, but vaguely defined ideas about, limiting, not voting for wasteful budgets and stuff. I mean, you think about that. Like, you look at a budget, my idea of what's wasteful is going to be different than your idea of what's wasteful.
Absolutely.
Even among Republicans, we're going to have different ideas about that. But it's a loyalty pledge. You got to pledge loyalty to this group. And then if it works anything like a group in Idaho that is named the same thing and seems to be doing the same thing, where they put out a pledge and then they ran primary opponents against people who wouldn't sign the pledge. So, I mean, this is basically a concerted effort to, my perception, take on moderate Republicans and to get them out of office.
Reading that, the column that you put out and, looking a little bit into the Idaho stuff, I mean, $200,000 they spent on primaries, and after getting very few people actually sign the pledge on the front end, I think it was just a handful of people.
It was like 4 or 5 in their Senate in Idaho. Yeah.
But I also thought it was interesting that the Idaho group was started by activists, right? And I think we have this situation right now in North Dakota where you have activists who are also legislators. And so, like, the position that Representative Pritchard is, he's going to his colleagues and saying, you need to sign this thing, and if you don't, this organization is going to primary you. That doesn't lead to really good relationships and really good lawmaking moving forward.
That might be something for the voters of District 8 to think about, is how well their lawmaker is going to be playing with other lawmakers when it comes time to make deals.
It's a pretty clear sign that the sort of traditional Republicans need to get ready for this primary. We saw it last time where a lot of the Elkies of the world lost during the primary, and I think that there's a lot of money that was spent on behalf of the traditional Republicans, but they didn't have the energy. They didn't have the juice behind them. And some of these folks, they're going to have the energy. They're going to be out pulling people their polls, and they need to be ready for that.
And a lot of the money was spent kind of in, they carpet bombed districts with mailers. And I just don't think, it's going to have to be more on the ground activism. Like, you're going to have to fund people, knocking on doors. You're going to have to fund people who will turn people out at district conventions, turn people out at primaries. Like, they're going to have to engage, because they can't just count on, hey, I'm, your lawmaker, and I've been here for a long time, and you know me, and we have an established, and I'm a Republican, which is currency in a lot of the state. That's not going to work anymore.
Well, and especially a lot of these folks that I think are in danger of being primaried aren't people who've had competitive races, either in a long, long time or never.
They haven't had to work for it in a while.
Yeah,
because their primary opposition was Democrats, and all due respect to our Democratic friends, they have faded in a lot of the state. They're just not. They're not really there anymore. So now the challenge is from other Republicans.
And the best time to build up name ID and relationships with voters is during an election. But if you're running unopposed and you're not spending money on mailers, you're not knocking on doors, you're not doing that thing, you don't have the traditional advantages of an incumbent going into a primary if you've never really had competitive races or haven't for a long, long time. And so I think the traditional Republicans and groups who care about good governance need to really step into this space now and stand up for. Again, I go back to good governance. I'm a Democrat, But here's the deal. I just want normalcy at the legislature. I want people up there that can have conversations based on facts and focus on things that matter to North Dakotans' everyday lives. And I don't think that's necessarily the case with some of the folks that Representative Pritchard is going to be pushing.
You know, it's really interesting. We started out this talking about lawmakers blaming attorneys for bringing up lawsuits, like it's the attorney's fault for the things that happen. You know, I have my opinions about Representative Pritchard and his motivations. But nobody should take their elected office for granted.
Nope.
So I don't really have a problem with whatever I may think of their motivations, or whether I think they're right on the issues or what have you. There's nothing wrong with making people work for it. So that's not the problem. Normie Republicans are going to have to start working for it in a way that they haven't had to in a long time. And I hope that they rise to the challenge. I don't like this pledge stuff. I think that think of the situation, like you don't sign it and they primary you. You do sign it, but it's so vague and arbitrary, they could basically accuse you of violating it at any time, and then they'll primary you. And the whole idea, like the only pledge I really want from the elected officials, I like the oath of office, where they're going to uphold the state constitution and the national constitution. And then I want them to pledge loyalty to their constituents that elected them, even the ones that didn't vote for them.
Right.
Like your job is to represent, job is not to represent your party, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. Your job is not to represent some organization like Pritchard's that asks you to sign a pledge, right? That's what the communists do in China. Like where your job is to support the Chinese Communist Party. Your job is to serve the constituents. So I wouldn't worry about this pledge. I would, however, get ready to work for it because you're going to have to.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. There's a district, 30 whatever Senate seat. It's not owned by any one individual who happens to be sitting in it now. It's the constituents of that district Senate seat. And I do think you're right that there's a lot of people who take for granted that they think this is their seat. Like, how dare somebody challenge me for my seat? It's not your seat. It's the constituents of your district. And I just hope they're ready. I mean, I think I told you that I can come up with a list of a couple dozen Republicans that are potentially seen as traditional that could be challenged.
Who are going to be on the ballot this cycle.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And you start thinking about if the GOP, North Dakota GOP in the legislature loses another 12 traditional Republicans, what does that mean for governing next session? I mean, it's tough. It's tough to think about.
You think about all the crazy bills that come up from kind of that wing of the party that ultimately get killed pretty reliably. Not all of them of late, but most of them. Maybe they don't get killed anymore.
Right. Well, and then you take into consideration term limits and what that means for traditional Republicans. And, it's not the greatest work environment these days up at the state capitol to be talking about a lot of stuff that don't matter to your constituents. I just worry.
I worry too. All right. Well, we'll put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening as always, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.